Right. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you yet again for our last formal session with external speakers. Appreciate those of you for being with us today. Hopefully additional individuals will continue to trickle in as schedules permit, because we do have a really exciting conversation planned for today. Before I hand it over to our speakers, though, I wanted to share a few brief announcements. One, thank you to everyone who has submitted their final assignment already. I will be spending a lot of this week looking at those and providing feedback where necessary. For schools that have put forward a final paper, I know that was a handful of you, that there was an additional requirement for a longer paper requirement. I'm in conversation with the advisory committee to make sure that those can be seen by additional schools, recognizing the amount of work that you have put into that work product. And we're going to have a conversation at the advisory committee level to determine if and how those might be published at other schools within their academic journals as appropriate. So I will be in conversation with faculty advisors to coordinate on what that might look like, if additional edits are required, as well as to get necessary permissions. So never fear, nothing would be published without your knowledge, but want you to know that I'm really appreciative of all of the work that has gone into those papers and want to make sure it's seen by the widest possible audience. I do obviously have access to publishing on the consortium's website, but based off of the numbers that I've seen, we're not getting as many visits to that site. So I want to, again, make sure that it's seen by additional eyes. Also, as next week is our final meeting, I will create a sign-up sheet in the Google Drive so that each individual who will be in attendance can sign up for a 5-minute block. During that 5-minute block, I would ask that you give an overview of your research, what you learned during that experience, identify what possible next steps might be for your school within the fellowship program, as well as in research related to policing practices, and then provide me with a bit of feedback or recommendations on how the fellowship might be structured differently or to be better suited to either your personal needs or the needs of your school. So I will put all of that into writing for everyone to have to hand. But I think next week should also be a great conversation and allow everyone in attendance to get a better understanding on what their fellows have undertaken this semester. Finally, I am so excited to share that the consortium launched last week the Law of the Police Scholarly Database on our website. So this is a compendium of resources that have been submitted by academics at a variety of law schools across the country. So we did not just limit it to consortium member schools, but this is all of the submissions that we've received around a host of issues related to the law of the police. So you can filter it both by individual school, by a variety of different tags, as well as authors, so that you have a better understanding of who the experts are in this space, where they're sitting, and the type of scholarship that they are putting out there. I want to give a big shout out. He's not currently in attendance, but Jan in Arizona, our fellow, who was a big help to me in putting this together, as well as students at SMU Dedman, who were not fellows, but dedicated an awful lot of time to getting this ready for publication. So please, at your leisure, take some time with this, poke around, see who some of the experts are. I know that I've previously shared some of this information to students putting together policing symposium. So if that is you, if that is of interest, this is a great resource to also better understand where relevant scholarship is originating. Great. Well, that is everything from me. So today I get to introduce some super cool folks who are doing amazing work in our policing space to talk to us about collaboration to promote public safety. And our speakers today come from CNA, which is a federally funded nonprofit research and analysis organization based quite close to me in Arlington, Virginia. And so today we are joined by Zoe Thorkildsen and Carrie Richardson. Will share their bios with you all separately so as to not take the time and also not make anyone experience the secondhand embarrassment of all of their accomplishments being read out in front of a public space. But Zoe and Carrie, thank you so much for being with us today. And we look forward to hearing and learning alongside you.
Great, thanks, Jesselyn. We're very excited to be here. Really appreciate the invitation to speak. So just briefly, Carrie and I both work in the Center for Justice Research and Innovation at CNA. Both of us have been here for a number of years, working in various aspects of the justice space, including with law enforcement agencies across the country. Our team does a mixture of research, training and technical assistance, and organizational reform and change. And so we're going to be talking to you guys today a little bit about some of our work with local law enforcement agencies. So I am going to share some slides, but I very much welcome folks to sort of jump in if you have questions or you want to discuss something on the slides in more detail. So this can be somewhat conversational. Let's see, there we go. So just sort of setting the stage, I'm going to do a little introduction and background, the general approach we take to these assessments that we do in law enforcement agencies. And then Carrie's going to speak about two specific assessments we did for the Charleston, South Carolina Police Department and the Methuen, Massachusetts Police Department. And then I'll close up with a little bit of lessons learned, and then we can have some discussion and questions and answers. So our team, JRI, provides assessments to local jurisdictional law enforcement agencies, typically mostly at the municipal and county level, and we have done some engagements with state agencies as well. And these sort of fall into four categories: racial bias assessments, staffing analyses, operations analysis, and after action analysis. We've sort of seen these different areas ebb and flow over the last few years. As you can no doubt imagine, racial bias assessments became increasingly important and of interest to agencies in the last 3 years. Staffing analyses are something that agencies frequently do contract out to vendors to provide because few of them have the capabilities in-house. And these are to determine what a full staffing should look like in an agency in terms of number of officers in order to respond to the community. Operations analysis is sort of a bucket term for going in and just like working with the agency on policies, practices, procedures in general in that agency. And then after action analysis, we do, after a critical incident has taken place, then that could be, a protest response or an officer involved shooting, to understand how that incident unfolded and how the agency can improve their operations in the future. So as I said, beginning in 2020, there were an increasing number of jurisdictions that were issuing requests for proposals for racial bias and other types of assessments. So prior to that timeframe, there was sort of a moderate degree of agencies that were interested in these types of assessments. But there was a program at the federal level, the Collaborative Reform Initiative, that had been meeting some of those goals, which ran from about 2012 to about 2016. During the Trump administration, the program shifted gears substantially and was no longer really focused on constitutional policing practices and uncovering sources of racial bias in agencies. It's now swinging back to that focus. So those insufficient federal resources that were sort of around, and then obviously the high profile deaths and shootings of community members that had taken place, agencies in communities were increasingly interested in having their practices and policies reviewed. I
think we're frozen. Harry, are you able to take over from here and I can drop Zoe a note? Oh, maybe they're both frozen? Uh-oh. All right, folks, bear with me just 1 second. Oh, there we go. Re-entering will help. Does anyone want to talk about the end of their term or perhaps their research while we're waiting for our guests to rejoin?
Jesslyn, would I be able to do my thing now instead of next Monday, since it's the religious holiday that I was telling you about?
Sure, sure.
Okay. I'm like kind of ready for it. So sorry, I'm in a car. I'm not driving though.
Okay, good. I was gonna say, if you are driving, I'm gonna say that's a hard
No,
no.
I would not. I would not be doing it if I was. So can anyone hear me well? Everyone hears me?
Yes.
Okay. I attend Wayne State Law School, and I'm a fellow with Wade, who is me. Also, at any point, feel free to interrupt me if they've like popped back in. But we've me and Wade have split what the Board of Police Commissioners in Detroit, who is kind of the oversight committee for the Detroit Police Department. We've kind of split what they've suggested for us to research, right? So Wade has been doing a lot of the shot spotter research, and although we like update each other every week on our research, I haven't had much to do with the shot spotter research. What I've focused on is specifically use of force. And so the question kind of started with, well, we are getting these Detroit Police Department use of force reports every year, and they include different categorizations of use of force. There's 4 categories, and they measure both the amount of force that is used by police. The use of force is categorized by 2 ways, which is kind of, this is not, I haven't found that this is common. They measure, or they categorize the use of force by both the harm that was caused and the force that was used. A lot of jurisdictions will just measure the categorizations of use of force based off the harm that was caused. So like what kind of injury resulted. A lot of jurisdictions will mainly focus on like whether there was weapons used, whether there was physical contact. DPD does both. It measures kind of with both, which I thought was interesting. But what I've really tended to focus on is, well, the question started with, is the use of tasers, like the question was about the meaning of the word use of tasers, right? So does that mean actual physical contact? Are you just kind of, they're threatening with a taser, or is it reaching the suspect or the subject? So that kind of brought me into a bigger question of what does use of force mean, the specific word of use. Does that include only physical harm, or does that also include psychological harm? Also, does that only mean force that is used with a weapon, or weaponless use of force? And I've just done a ton of research about that. There was this huge study that was done in 6 major US cities. I can't list them, I think it's like San Diego, somewhere in Colorado. I can't like list them at the top of my head, but the research there, it just did a huge research project. It created basically 5 elements of force, it called them. And then from those 5 elements of force, it created 4 measures of force. And it did that by using a survey that it gave to the police departments in these cities, in these 6 major cities, and the police would just have to fill out the survey form after arrests. So I thought this form that they used to be able to measure the use of force that was used and be able to categorize it better, I thought that form was very specific and intricate, and I thought that form would be a great help for the Board of Police Commissioners to be able to gather information on Detroit Police Department's use of force, since it does these weekly, I think the Board of Police Commissioners does weekly meetings, and the DPD does the yearly reports of use of force. I just thought it would be a great way to specify further the different categorizations of use of force by the Detroit Police Department. The current categorizations are, in my opinion, more specific than other cities, which is good. But it's very important, like the research have just shown, and as we've talked about a lot in our meetings, the communication between the community's needs and the police department is very essential to be able to figure out what use means in the specific scenario, what is allowed, what is not allowed, what is necessary, and what's excessive use of force. And that's basically just a little overview of what I've done. I hope that was good.
That was great. Yeah, and an excellent overview of some of the work that was being done. I do have some questions about what next steps might entail, but Zoe has returned.
Awesome.
And so want to
Okay.
give her the floor back. So perhaps we can, for Wade's portion of the conversation next week, we can talk about what next steps would entail and what Karma, if you could feed any feedback that you have to Wade, make sure that the full perspective is reflected. Thank you so much for that, particularly for being comfortable in presenting on the fly. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Right. Zoe, apologies for frustration and the gremlins in the system.
Yeah, it appears that maybe CNA's internet is down, and since I VPN, that means that my internet then went down, even though I'm nowhere near CNA right now. All right, so I don't know exactly where I was cut off and how long I was talking to myself, but I hope I was on this slide and that you saw me get to this slide. So providing our approach. So the thing that we think partially distinguishes our teams and our approach to this is that we bring both objective analysis from analytical staff, like myself.
Oh, yikes. This might be a larger issue for us today. I don't know if anyone tried to pull up the CNA website in anticipation for the conversation, but that was also down. So I flagged that for them. But I think there might be larger technical issues at play.
Can I jump in if that's the case?
Okay.
And just ask Karma if the definition of use of force that Detroit was using, does that have anything to do with the consent decree that the DOJ placed on, or they agreed to with them? Because they may have actually given Detroit a definition of what force is and how to report it. So I don't know how much that was actually a factor.
You know, I'm not sure. In the actual report, which was extensive, but not that extensive, it did not say where it was getting its categorizations from. I know that other jurisdictions I've looked at have mentioned, well, that they've just gotten their definitions from like the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They've just copied different jurisdictional or authorities to make that conclusion. But based off what the report that I've seen, that would be an interesting point. I haven't finished my paper. I will write that down to maybe possibly include in my paper.
And so as kind of a follow-up to that, Michigan has a use of force guidelines or continuum, if you will. It's actually in my paper, but that's easy to get from MCOLS, which is the authority granting or the authority granting power, whatever, for Michigan police. So that may have additional definitions for you.
Yes. Okay, I'll definitely look at that. Interesting that our topics are similar. I'll definitely look at that. There in the research paper that I was mentioning, sorry, the research project or study that had been done, one of the measures of force that it specified was the continuum of force. So that was a very big part of my conclusion, I guess, and a recommendation at the end. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Do see Carrie rejoining, but wonder if in the meantime, from Wade, do you have any recommendations on should Wayne continue on with the consortium fellowship, what ongoing work in this space on this topic might entail?
Excuse me, can you clarify that? Am I talking about the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners, or am I talking about the relationship with this fellowship?
Well, I'm just asking more broadly around, based off of your conversations, based off of your work this semester and Wade for you this year, if your school were to take the next steps in your research, what that might entail and what you would hope would come out of that.
Well, actually, I'm supposed to give a presentation to the Board of Police Commissioners and a final memo, which is not going to happen until after the semester. So after the semester, I have a lot more work to do for the fellowship, actually. So, because we need to get permission to talk to community members, because it's for ShotSpotter. I'm not going to get into what ShotSpotter is, because I'll do that next week. But we want to know if the community thinks ShotSpotter is working, if they think it's a safer community because of ShotSpotter. Because if they feel less safe for the ShotSpotter and ShotSpotter statistics aren't that impressive, I mean, what are we doing then? So hopefully, I mean, I'm kind of a fan of ShotSpotter, even though there's a lot of critique, but I'm hoping to hear back from the community that the next step is that ShotSpotter should go along with the $7 million expansion in Detroit, and it's creating a better environment for the community. Because the mayor seems to give statistics and think it's fantastic, but the BOP, Board of Police Commissioner statistics aren't that impressive, but they're not unimpressive, but there'll be like 3 guns recovered for like every few thousand shots. So it's,
Sorry.
but I think the next step would just be, as far as Wayne Law School's fellowship, is to continue the Board of Police Commissioners and work on stuff that they think is prevalent that will actually impact the Board of Police Commissioners, instead of just making a paper that is just going to be in Wayne. We're actually engaging with the Detroit Police Department or the Board of Police Commissioners and adding and contributing to that organization.
I love that. I think that seems very forward thinking. And while you may not feel this, I love to hear that the work is going to continue once the fellowship is concluded. So apologies for continuing to add to your plate, but awesome to hear what's coming down the pike. Zoe, Carrie, we're back. Hopefully for good this time?
Maybe for good this time.
Okay.
I have no earthly clue what is going on, but everyone's still moving, so that's good, because last time, the second I started talking, everyone froze. All right, so let's try this one more time. So I think, as I was saying, we combine analysts and law enforcement experts and doing our assessments. And we think that this, provides a big value add, because we're both bringing the evidence-based, analytical side, data-driven analysis to it, but then also folks who speak the same language as the agencies that we're working with, and have that credibility of having worked in the field. And they also serve as a good, sort of practical perspective on the recommendations that we may make to an agency, to make sure that we're choosing things that are actionable and plausible for agencies to implement, which is, of course, really critical when you're developing your findings and recommendations, if you do want to result in sustained organizational change, which is our goal. So as I sort of alluded to, we have some common topics that we frequently see come up from communities and agencies. Obviously, recently in particular, racial disparities in law enforcement activity, the work of the agency in terms of community-oriented and problem-solving policing use, use of force. And I heard someone is, doing a a project or a paper on the issue around use of force as well. The complaint process, both internally generated complaints, which be, for example, discipline issues or policy violations, as well as those externally generated from community members, and then recruitment, hiring, promotions, and personnel practices as well. So we use sort of a custom, but somewhat within a certain approach for data collection and analysis. So there's typically sort of 4 main types of data collection data sources that we use when working with these agencies. So policies and documents, so everything basically that they have in writing, which we then compare with best practices and subject matter experts. We do analysis of administrative data. So this is everything from traffic stops to use of force, to complaints. We typically do descriptive analysis on this and then introduce statistical comparisons as when that's possible. A lot of agencies don't collect really in-depth data on these types of activities, and so that's often the limitation. There's only so much statistical analysis you can do if they, for example, only collect 5 or 6 variables about each traffic stop. And then we also do intensive work getting qualitative data from both the agency personnel and the community. So typically we do this through a combination of one-on-one interviews and then large listening sessions in the community, and then one-on-one interviews and sometimes focus groups with department personnel. And then we are also increasingly doing surveys of department personnel in the community to understand, sort of a broader set of people than you can get to, obviously, with interviews and listening sessions. And so in each of these engagements, we do develop specific findings and recommendations for the agency based in the evidence, but also, as I said, being practical and actionable. And we do provide a process by which, when we develop our draft list of them, that gets circulated both to the department and the city, but also the community before we finalize them, so that there's an opportunity for feedback if we've missed anything or overlooked anything or gotten the nuances of something wrong. And then we do offer, though, unfortunately, a lot of cities aren't necessarily interested in paying for continued support after the assessment, but we do offer implementation support to help agencies with implementing the findings and recommendations. So I'm now going to turn it over to Carrie to talk a little bit about 2 specific projects.
Yes, thank you, Zoe. Can you all hear me okay? I'm on my phone.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Hopefully trying to avoid any other technology challenges that we might have. But I am going to start off by talking about our racial bias audit that we did for the Charleston Police Department in South Carolina back in around 2018, 2019. And of course, guys, ask questions, or if there's any comments that you have that relates to the current work or research you do, I certainly welcome that as we go through these slides. But we'll start with a little bit of background on Charleston. So Charleston does have a rich history, which provides some context regarding the culture and perspectives that the local community have. So as we started to do our work there, it was clear that many people felt that the history's role in the slave trade has continued to impact and influence some of the existing racial tensions, most notably with the 2015 massacre at Mother Emanuel Church. And the City Council made an effort to address this and address the racial tensions and tried to move towards achieving some healing and reconciliation. So they issued a 2-page report in 2018 that wanted to serve as a resolution or an apology for their role in the slave trade and made a statement towards racial reconciliation. And they also made it a point to start to prioritize community and police relations and kind of put that at the forefront for the city's priorities. So one of the examples of these efforts was the Illumination Project, which was established in 2015 and worked to identify some strategies to improve community-police relationships. And one of those was to establish a community police advisory council. But these concerns continue to exist and even grew after some findings from the College of Charleston's report on the state of racial disparities in Charleston, which noted racial disparities and the linkage between structural racism and economic inequality. So they called in CNA to come in and to conduct a racial bias audit and to establish some findings and recommendations for them. And we'll just go over some of the goals and objectives really quickly. Of course, one of the key goals and objectives was to assess, monitor, and assist the agency in overcoming any aspects of implicit bias or systematic bias, as well as to assess the enforcement operations of historically marginalized groups, especially those in the African American community. Another objective was to provide recommendations for reform that could improve community-oriented policing practices. So that includes things like transparency, professionalism, accountability, inclusion, as well as community trust. And then lastly, another goal was to engage the community and to understand all the different perspectives that the community had, as well as their experiences with the department. And kind of an overarching part of this is taking into account national best practices and the community's expectations in this work. So we can move on to the next slide. So the key focus areas for this audit included looking at traffic stops, use of force, looking at complaints, focusing on community-oriented policing, and looking at recruitment, hiring, and promotion practices. And we did this a number of different ways. We conducted document reviews, so looking at things like policy, field guides, training curriculum. We also conducted a number of interviews with staff and community stakeholders. We also held a number of community meetings and, of course, conducted data analysis with these, within these areas. And here we just have a couple of the key findings from our audit. So I think in total we had about 50 findings and maybe 70 recommendations. So here are some of the key ones. We found that overall there was poor data collection mechanisms. There wasn't really consistent documentation being collected on field contacts in other areas. We found that there was disparities in traffic stops that ended in warnings, and there was disparities in the stop rates, and these disparities existed both with the traffic stops and field contacts, as well as the use of force, as far as the negative disparities for our African Americans. We also found that policies were not reviewed often, they were not revised often, and some of them lacked some important clarifying language, so we made some recommendations for that. We also found that there was a disparity in the application of force, but not among the type of force that was used whenever there was force used. We also found that there were not really clear strategies for how to engage with the community, and those approaches to involve the community's perspectives when making decisions and creating policies and practices for the department. And we also found that overall there was some structure lacking, so things like hiring plans and performance reviews were not conducted regularly, and there were not really any plans or structure that would guide those activities. And then finally, there was a lot of formal supervising training and also training on things like cultural awareness and community policing was not fully established. So we can go on to our some of the key recommendations that we found. We recommended that they keep better track of their officers completing these forms, and that they implement additional ways to capture data that would allow further analysis to be done. We always try to do as much analysis as we can with the data that's available, but departments don't always capture the data at all, or in a way that allows us to do all the analysis that would be helpful. So we made some recommendations for that. We also recommended that they develop an action plan to address implicit bias and include some concrete activities such as training. We also recommended that they conduct regular analysis of their use of force incidents with the goal of addressing the disparities in use of force as it relates to the race of the community member. We also recommended a sanctity of life statement and the use of force policy, as well as additional training on several different areas, a lot of those involving community and policing. So things like interpersonal skills, cultural awareness and sensitivity, and non-enforcement engagement. And we also recommended that they leverage their existing relationship with their advisory council to gather community feedback and to involve the community more. So lastly, I'll just briefly talk about some of the impacts from this. So we actually learned, I think it was a couple of years ago, that the Charleston Police Department did make some movement on our recommendations, and they hired a personnel to support the audit implementation or the audit findings and recommendation implementation, and to track and report the status of that. And they actually asked CNA to come in and to do a brief review of the report, and they were exploring the bringing in a third party or independent person to kind of review their status and report. They did note that they did make some changes to policy and that they hired a subject matter expert, some of their use of force procedure amendments, and also provided some additional training. And often it does take time to see the impacts of some of this work, but that's just a brief overview of some of the work that we did in Charleston. And we can move on to the next slide. So next I wanted to highlight some of the work that we did for Methuen. So this was actually a performance audit, so it's a little bit of different work that we do and kind of reflect some of the different types of assessments that we do. So CNA was called in to do a review, and this followed many years of increased public scrutiny on the police and police community relations and the calls for needs for organizational improvement. So the city had made a statement about how these type of evaluations or an audit and this type of evaluation that CNA ended up doing could help the department's performance and identify any areas for further improvements and help them make some important corrective action. So a lot of the work that we ended up doing with Methuen, it did turn a little political, and I think some of the work that we do, it can sometimes be sensitive to politics. So throughout our work, there was a local news outlet that was, following the audit and capturing our progress and capturing the sometimes sensitive nature of the work that we do. So initially started reporting on some of the administrative aspects, but it started to shift and start to highlight some of the tense and emerging emotional areas of the department, including some allegations about the chief and the command staff and concerns about nepotism and unfair promotion practices and things like that. As these concerns and criticisms mounted, there was a vote by their city council, I believe, of no confidence about their police chief, and called into question things like the promotional process and hiring and things like that. So we continued our work, remaining objective and independent from any of these outside events that were going on. I think there might have been an outside investigation going on, looking at the same things that we were looking at, but we just kind of continued to do our work. So if we go into the next slide, I'll briefly touch on some of the goals and objectives and focus areas. So collecting and analyzing data was one of the key objectives related to department structure, operation, and cultural perceptions within the agency. We also wanted to identify any existing areas that could use improvement related to performance. So that included organizational and budgetary areas, as well as policy and practice. We also wanted to align their operations with professional standards and innovative best practices. And lastly, wanted to make recommendations for operational and organizational strategies that would allow the department to work in the most effective manner. So some of the focus areas: organizational structure and governance, planning, budgeting, operational policy and procedure, and department department culture, and I'll say that department culture tended to be, or ended up being, one of the larger focus areas as we were gathering our data and doing our analysis. So we did several methods of data collection for this and approaches. So we conducted document reviews similar to what we did in Charleston. We did a comparison analysis for our staffing analysis that we did. So we looked at agencies who were similarly sized and looked to compare their staffing levels. We also did a work environment or cultural survey with their staff and conducted a series of interviews with their staff. So we can go on to look at our findings. We found that their staffing numbers were lower in comparison to some of the other similarly sized agencies. We found that many of their policies were not revised recently, or were missing the date of issue or in the date of provisions. We also found that they lacked a process to acquire technology. And I think one of our more significant findings was that about half of the employees were dissatisfied with the department and how they, how the department was managed. There were about 37% that were satisfied, but in the survey responses, it did reveal some concerns about promotion and assignment. A lot of people felt that those processes were not fair and favored people that were favored by the police chief. And those people felt that there was a culture of fear and that there was retaliation from speaking out and raising concerns at higher levels about the treatment. And there was just overall low confidence in the fairness of a lot of the assignment, a lot of the processes, including the assignment process. People felt that, based on your favorability of the chief, you could get certain assignments that were looked at as more favorable or less favorable. So we can go ahead and move on to the last slide that talks about some of our recommendations, which really focused on strengthening and formalizing some of their existing structures. So this was included for recruitment and for their policy review. We also recommended that they kind of do an overview of their current recruitment process to try and attract more diverse candidates. We also recommended that they work with members of the department to develop processes to foster an environment where officers could feel safer. So we recommended using things like autonomous surveys or working groups or other two-way communication approaches that could be regular and could be followed up on. We also recommended that they create standardized plans for technology and their hiring and promotion practices, as well as we recommended that they develop a policy that kind of outlines the department's philosophy on disciplinary procedures, clearing up any opportunities for inequity and ambiguity or the application of policy and practice. So as far as some of the impacts for this, I believe that there was a change in leadership following our report, and of course our reports never recommend any removal of command staff or changes, but we did present these findings to our city council, and they did commit to investing more in the wellness and support of the department and their officers. They were unaware of the high levels of satisfaction that existed in the department and the different allegations about unfair treatment. And we believe our report did highlight and put an increased focus on the hiring and promotion practices and just overall, assignments and other procedures there. It wasn't something that was talked about as openly as it was following our report. And I'll say again, sometimes the impacts of our reports and the implementing of these recommendations can sometimes take time and can take time to see some of the further impacts. I don't know if there's any questions or comments about that, but if not, I'll turn it back over to you, Zoe, to go over the lessons learned.
Sure, it's just a couple of brief slides, sort of takeaways. So we've done this kind of work in, I would say, a few dozen cities now. Carrie highlighted obviously 2 of them, but we've sort of learned a lot along the way. So the first being that sort of thorough and robust assessments do require the willingness of the local government to invest sufficient resources in the work. And this, I think, is, it's commonly sort of like a stumbling point, is that local government sometimes thinks that this is something that can be done for, say, like $15,000, which is just not even close to a realistic budget if you want the work to be done thoroughly and well and to the highest standards. So thankfully, we have had the opportunity to work in a lot of localities, but it is nice that the federal government is reinvesting in this work as well, because not every municipality obviously can afford to, pay for a $200,000 study of their law enforcement agency. Balancing urgency and then realism is also a challenge sometimes. We definitely see RFPs where, for example, they want the entire report done in, let's say, 60 days. We can, barely get a community meeting done in 60 days when you think about all the lead time that goes into, scheduling things and finding locations and things like that. So this is another area where, I think we've had to sort of teach a little bit in some of our responses for the request for proposals, by pushing back on unrealistic timeframes and letting them know how long it should take. Our experience is that 9 months is like the minimum time frame to get from an award to a completed final report. In part because the getting community input is one of the most critical elements of it, and that's not a process that you can rush through. We make a lot of data requests to the agencies, and some of them are able to turn those around very quickly, but for some of them it's more of a challenge, and that can also extend time frames. And then community and local stakeholder engagement is really critical. We obviously don't live and work in all these cities that we work with, and local context is so important. And sometimes you can get, 3 months into a project and suddenly discover that there's a community activist group specifically focused on policing, and somehow no one thought that was important to mention to us until we were 3 months into the project. And then you need to, make sure that you're touching those stakeholders so that they feel like they've been engaged in the process throughout. Otherwise, they can sometimes be the biggest critics if they feel like their voices weren't heard and they weren't given a chance to provide input to the work. And then sort of just looking forward, so the Biden administration has revitalized the consent decree machine in DOJ. They got, I think, 4 or 5 patterns and practices investigations currently ongoing, one of which just released their patterns and practices report in the Civil Rights Division. We support a few consent decrees, including the Chicago, Illinois consent decree at CNA. And so this is, one perhaps less collaborative, but mechanism that is available for addressing these types of concerns in law enforcement agencies. And then, as I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, the COPS office has renewed the collaborative reform initiative, and they are refocusing it on organizational assessments as it was originally when it was originally conceived. So that work is ongoing as well. And then something we've been thinking about and talking about a lot at CNA is that while policing has sort of been under the microscope for the last 3+ years, in particular in society, that the racial disparities that we see in the policing system are not unique to that one element of the justice system. And so opportunities for other justice system elements to get ahead of the curve and start working on these issues, prosecution and defense, courts and corrections, to start addressing these types of procedural and potentially constitutional issues early rather than sort of being thrust into it. So that is what we wanted to share with you all today, and I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other's faces again and just open up for questions, comments, conversation.
Zoe, thank you so much for that. You're doing amazing work. And for additional context, folks, I wanted to bring these reps from CNA to us today to also better understand the way that your research can feed into something larger, recognizing the great work that each of you are doing in your communities, to give you a little bit of additional context on other both career paths as well as additional inspiration on how the work that you have undertaken this term might be used going forward. Katie, I see your hand.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a question about kind of how municipalities or agencies that are putting out RFPs scope the work. So specifically, like when an agency determines that they have like constitutional concerns, are those articulated? And what are they in this, like when you're evaluating like the constitutional risk that an agency is exposing itself to, like what is that, and like how do you talk about it?
Yeah, so the RFPs vary, as I'm sure you can imagine, widely in quality and thoroughness. Not local. That's something we have learned in doing this work directly for local governments. Some places have like really good RFP writers in their towns, and some places apparently have not identified those people. So oftentimes we see that the RFPs are partially driven by community members. So an activism group or a local organization that's specifically sort of providing oversight to the police department will essentially draft the RFP content based on the concerns that they have about the police department's operations. And then the city government will, use that language. Sometimes we see that they've been copy pasted from other RFPs that we have responded to previously. It's always nice to see work ding. And then sometimes there have been a few cases where they've actually known of CNA ahead of time and have worked with us to develop an RFP based on concerns that they have about local police operations. And in terms of sort of your second part, I think that it's largely sort of informally understood constitutional issues that they're seeing and hearing from community members. And so it's usually very driven by the community itself and what concerns they are raising. Oftentimes precipitated by a very specific incident taking place. Typically a shooting of a Black or Hispanic community member. And that is what will sort of push it over the edge to the city council to, develop an RFP and allocate funding for this kind of work.
Stephen.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your report. So in looking at both of the case studies, staffing was an issue in both of them. And I'm wondering if, because law enforcement agencies throughout the country today are so desperately looking for people to work there, I'm thinking that the law enforcement agencies themselves would just jump all over your report and say, oh, this is great. I'm going to take this to the city council or to the county commissioners, whatever. The other kind of concern or question that I had was, do you have any experience working with accredited versus non-accredited agencies? Thank you.
Yeah, so on the staffing front, yes, you're right. We never lose friends when we tell them that they need more staff in their department. But I'm going to let Carrie speak a little bit because the recruiting and retention is an area she focuses on, and as you said, the policing is reaching a crisis point in that area.
Yeah. So staffing is definitely an issue and has been a long-standing issue for police departments for some time. And I don't think anyone, in the department or at the city council level disagrees that more staffing is needed. It's a matter of recruiting is the larger issue rather than having the funding available to support hiring the officers. So it's difficult to find individuals who want to pursue a career as a law enforcement officer, or at least more difficult than it has been in the past. So and now working with agencies, it's helping them strategize, it's helping them put together a recruitment plan, because for many years, in a law enforcement agencies can be quite traditional, and there hasn't been a lot of a need maybe previously to develop a recruitment plan, and maybe they haven't had as much difficulty in recruiting as they're facing in recent years. So that seems to be the area where we tend to come in and support, helping them to develop a recruitment plan to try and increase their numbers and to find folks and bring them into the academy and have them joining the department.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of that is helping agencies think through their their required qualifications and whether all of the sort of disqualifying factors that they have are really necessary as disqualifying factors. One area that agencies increasingly are lightening up about is past marijuana use, because that for a long time it was just a complete disqualifying factor, and it's increasingly impossible to find anyone who can meet that one. So, the agencies are starting to think through also in the recruitment pipeline, what is going on at the academy and where are they losing people in the academy training. And frequently it's due to physical fitness requirements. And, there are obviously ways that agencies could proactively choose to, work with academy trainees to overcome those issues rather than just washing them out. And to your second question about accreditation, so I assume you mean CALIA accreditation, or state accreditations.
It could be both, either state accreditation or CALIA, sure.
Yeah, so we did do a project just recently helping an agency with getting their state accreditation up and running. I think the thing that to take away from sort of the CALIA standards and the state standards as well is that frequently, while it's considered a gold star for an agency to have a CALIA accreditation, it doesn't necessarily mean CALIA doesn't go in and read all their policies, right? They verify they have policies on certain things. And so the work we do, we can go in and say, like, yes, you meet your CALIA accreditation by having a use of force policy, but is it a good use of force policy?
And if I may, because I've done assessments of over 1,000 law enforcement agencies in my career, and I think you're spot on with that. CALIA says, yes, you've got policies, but they're not necessarily good policies and they're not necessarily followed, which is probably the worst thing you could ever do, is have a policy and not follow it, right? So thank you for that.
Yep.
I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask a question of my own. I'm curious, and once these assessments have been delivered, and if some of your recommendations are adopted, if any of these agencies have then requested follow-up studies to determine if their implementation is working, and if it is working, according to whom, what does effectiveness in implementation look like?
Yeah, so far, no. Charleston did issue an RFP to have that done, but they ended up not making an award under it. So more so we hear back from it informally from folks, or Charleston actually has a web page where they keep the community updated on their progress on the findings and recommendations. They're self-assessing though, and they have self-assessed themselves to be done and have fully implemented everything. Whether we would agree with them or not, I do not know. But they are at least taking the onus of, continuing to update the community on their progress. They really bought into the importance of the report and doing the implementation work. Other agencies, we try to make our reports and the recommendations useful, and so the agencies will want to be implementing them, but you never know that it doesn't just get sort of filed on a shelf and not looked at again. We did do some work in Minneapolis that I know was continued after we completed our report, which who knows what's going to happen with Minneapolis and their multiple consent decrees in the coming years, since they are under a state consent decree as of a couple of days ago, and the federal one is obviously still in progress, but almost certainly will result in a consent decree as well. So sometimes we just hear about it or we see it on the news, but it's not because we went back in and did it. We would love to be able to do that kind of work, but just municipalities tend to see less value in it, and so they're less willing to put up the money for it.
And I think one thing adding to that, sometimes when we work with community members and we involve them in the assessment, they feel like they're a part of it and can kind of help be a driving force. I think that was a big case in Charleston, and starting to see that as well for other assessments that are currently ongoing. They really want to take the report and use it to hold their city council and department accountable and say like, are you guys doing these things? So that can kind of have an impact as well.
And then thinking through the sensitivity of some of the majority of the work that you're doing, are all of the reports that you're putting out publicly available, or some of them restricted to the departments that have commissioned the work?
So we highly recommend that the reports be made public at the end of the work. Taxpayers are paying for them, right? So they should get to see the results of the work that's being done. Sometimes we have had sort of like a separate appendix with law enforcement sensitive information in it. And that would be stuff where it was at such a level of like tactical or operational detail that it necessitated being kept sensitive. But that's usually only in our after action analyses, where we may have things that are at the level of like tactical response recommendations, which departments do tend to keep non-public. But yeah, almost all of our reports are public facing, including the ones that Carrie discussed today.
I can keep going, but encourage other fellows to come up with questions of their own, because I think I'm super curious about the community outreach and engagement with local stakeholders. And I've heard from our fellows who both this semester as well as last year did a mapping exercise to get information around local civil rights and community organizations that are working on policing issues. We've got a map of the data that was collected on our website right now. But one of the flags that was raised for me was that in some of these communities, there's just so many. And so how do you go about determining how many seats you have at the table and how many voices to include before you recognize like, okay, now we have enough information from all of the necessary stakeholders to proceed?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's often a point of contention that we face, because there's always one more person who thinks that their voice is like the most critical one we need to listen to. So, as researchers, we would say you get to the point of thematic satiation, and that is when you're finished with your qualitative data collection. You get to a point where each additional interview you do, you're not gaining any new themes or new insights, and so that's when you would call yourself finished. That is often, no matter how many times I've tried to explain that to city councils, they do not find it to be a satisfying answer at all. So because they think well, you talk to 40 people, that can't possibly like be all the viewpoints in our whole city of 100,000. And that's fair, but you know, this is a pretty well-established qualitative technique and is, you know, borne out by researchers. So one thing we have been doing is coupling the interviews with surveys so that way we can speak to having gotten both broad and deep in the project. And that seems to be a lot more palatable to the local city councils. As far as like figuring out who the seats at the table are, frequently it's almost sort of like pre-established. You know, the agency has a group of organizations it knows that are doing, you know, sort of police accountability monitoring type work in their community, and they're pretty quickly able to like generate that list of names and organizations. And then from there, we do like snowball sampling. So when we do an interview with somebody, we ask if there's someone else that we should really be speaking to. And we just sort of continue down that path.
Thank you. Katie.
Thanks again. The thing that this kind of most strongly reminds me of is the kind of like it feels analogous to the kind of like economic data collection that like, you know, cities commission all the time. I'm thinking about like fiscal impact analyses and the various studies that like undergo like, you know, development. And my experience in kind of engaging with municipal advocacy around other types of studies is that cities tend to, it seems like cities tend to commission like a $200,000 study when they have a clear idea of what they want to do and want to be able to justify it. And I'm curious in this, like, it's interesting to me that you say that, like in a lot of cases, it's like community organizations or community advocates who are kind of driving that, which is like not my experience with like, you know, a real estate study, for instance, where it's like coming directly from the city's planning department. Like, I am curious as to whether, you know, when a city council or a local government will fund this, is it typical that they already have changes in mind that they want to make? And do you find that the studies tend to kind of like shift the boat at all in that regard?
So yes, there definitely are cases where they're looking for a justification for a decision that's already been made. In essence, we're the wrong company to hire if that's what you want. And we try to make it pretty clear in our proposal responses that that's the case, so that we're not going to be selected for that kind of work. Sometimes it's like very apparent in the RFP, and we choose not to respond in those cases if we think there's like a pretty clear agenda going into it. That said, many times people sort of have some ideas of what changes they want to see, but they're on the right track, in which case then, you know, we are the right company to help you understand the issue better and justify the reasoning behind why a certain change is going to be made. But I think probably the one place where we were the most like it was more city focused was Minneapolis, because the work we did for them was specifically a staffing analysis. And the city council had been having a lot of sort of very contentious discussion about like what the appropriate level of staffing was for the Minneapolis Police Department. And I don't, maybe they feel some regret, because the city council really wanted a number, right? They wanted us to come in and say 800. That's the right number of officers to have. But what we gave them instead was, here are like 4 different levers you can push regarding how many officers you might need. Are you using one person cars or 2-person cars? What sort of response times do you want to be able to achieve when on priority 1 calls? And once you figured out the answers to those 4 questions, then here's the number. But we're not going to tell you the answers to those 4 questions, because that's a policy decision on your part. But that one was not as community focused, because it was specifically staffing analysis. I hope that answered your question.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yes.
When you're doing a staffing analysis, are you like of the analyses that you've done, say, over the last 3 years, are those in response to calls to reduce police budget?
I think that they are not so much budget. They're more about, so a lot of agencies are actually quite understaffed right now. And so having one of these analyses done helps them justify to the council that, we really are understaffed. Look, we had like experts come and tell us that. But the other thing that I think we're seeing sort of common themes is that they're also about understanding how the reimagining public safety conversation can have impacts on staffing requirements. So if we're going to say eliminate traffic stops in our department, which some agencies are doing, then what does that mean for the number of officers we now need? And is it less? And well, yes, obviously it's less. How much less is it? I guess more specifically.
David?
When you're analyzing the FTEs, do you get into certified officers versus reserve or auxiliary officers? And if so, what kind of impact does that have when you've got a fairly large percentage of reserves coming into the workforce?
So we don't break out the staffing analysis that way, but what we typically do is work on that in a more qualitative sense, as I think that's what your follow-up question is getting at, is that there are risks associated with having heavy reliance on reserve officers. And we encourage agencies to sort of explore and understand that better, but we don't break out our actual numerical distinctions that way.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? Anything that we've heard today resonate based off of the research that you've undertaken this semester? Katie?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at, looking at in the two case studies, at least one of them had mentioned the kind of like analysis of policies, like does it include particular things in their mission statement, or does it include dates, and one of the things, and I'm not doing it in a systematic or really formal way, I'm doing it in a kind of like, drive-by observational way. But I've been looking a lot at across the state of Rhode Island at how different school districts characterize their search and seizure policy, which I don't know because I'm not doing it in any kind of systematic way, but which I assume like reflects different levels of attentiveness to, like among other things, federal guidance on school resource officers. And so I think like that for me, I think is a really active question of like one, like if, we want to think that having really rigorous policies, or having will direct the conversation in a particular way. And I'm curious, or to what extent is like policy change practice is like one open question that I have in the back of my mind. Because I want to think that it does. And I want like all of these policies to be like really consistent and like reflect best practices. But yeah, and then I think doing like the utility of doing like a large scale analysis like this is like really valuable, I think. And it's hard to, like, I assume that there is a lot of kind of inconsistency in terms of how like municipality to municipality they address like every aspect of this question. And I think that's like a really interesting challenge that certainly reflects on some of the stuff I'm doing.
That's awesome to hear. Thank you for drawing those connections. I think that's great. Does anybody else want to reflect this information? Holly.
Hi, nothing super substantive. Just wanted to say that working in this space and researching policing, it's very incredibly helpful to have organizations like yours doing work like this so that we have stuff to base research off of. So just kind of a general thanks for doing this kind of work, because I think it's really valuable, and it's been really interesting to kind of learn more about how is this information that we are drawing conclusions and relying off of, how does it come to be? So thank you.
Well, that's a beautiful note to potentially end on. I think that is, as our fellows will know, I strongly recommend a practice of gratitude. So Holly, thank you for sharing that, and also wholly you want to uplift that message. Carrie and Zoe, thank you so much for being with us today, for sticking with us despite technical challenges, and for being present to share the great work that you're doing. And hopefully we can continue to elevate it further through our work and potentially through ongoing collaboration. So we really appreciate you being with us today, particularly so late in the evening. So now go out, go grab some sunshine while you can. Pollen counts are wild here in the DMV, so medicate appropriately and bring Kleenex. And we will be sure to be in touch with relevant findings, and hopefully we can keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. To the fellows, I'll send a follow-up note tomorrow with both the recording from this session as well as a sign-up sheet for how we can organize ourselves for Monday. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'll see you next week.